Welcome, everyone, to Developing the Next Generation of Little Allies. I'm your host, Julie Kratz. I'll be facilitating the conversation with you today. I'm joined by Catherine Buntain on my team. She'll be watching the chat and sharing resources there, so be sure to check those out. There's all sorts of great websites and tools that you can keep the conversation going there in the chat. And we also have Susie with us from the diversity movement. She'll be introducing herself shortly, as well as one of our fantastic collaboration partners in this space. So if I have yet to meet you, my name is Julie Kratz. I'm a speaker, a trainer, and an author focused on workplace inclusion, but most recently wrote a book, The Little Allies, about how to have this conversation with little ones in our lives. And by no means do you need to be a teacher, an educator, a caregiver, or a parent yourself for this conversation to be relevant. I truly believe that any little people you have in your life, meaning younger people, you can really benefit from having a dialogue with them about inclusion. How this conversation got started for me as being a corporate trainer and speaker focused on diversity and inclusion. After doing 7 years of this work and 12 years prior in my own corporate America experience, I thought, why are we waiting until people are older and beliefs and behaviors are pretty cemented in corporate America to have this conversation? Why aren't we talking earlier? And at the same time, I experienced a pandemic pregnant and had a 6-year-old daughter that was seeing the news and having conversations about racial justice. And I myself felt very conflicted about what to tell her, what not to tell her, how to protect her, but also be real about racism. And I still struggle with this today. It is very much a journey, not a destination in this allyship work. But I can tell you, as someone that's having these conversations actively with kiddos, I'm learning more from them than I think they are for me. And I walk away in those conversations always recharged, like they really believe in inclusion from a young age. All of this is kind of taught through the course of our life, through media, through socialization, through our schools, all these systems that perpetuate unfortunate circumstances like racism and sexism and many isms. So if only these kids could stay strong and stay on path for inclusion, what would the world look like? But they can't do it on their own. So we can't kick the can to this next generation, expecting them to miraculously solve centuries of inequality on their own. They need tools, they need information. And so that was the birth of Little Allies and the inspiration. And my story, this is me and my daughter, Jane, who we have these conversations with. You'll hear some stories about things she's experiencing as a 7-year-old that are troubling and inspiring all at the same time. And I'm so proud she got to see me do my TEDx talk. The last stage I spoke on last year, right before the pandemic, she was with me. And most recently, one of her classmates their parents found my TED talk online and told Jane that her mom was famous. I thought that was quite funny. I don't consider myself a famous person by any means, but it's really fun that she kind of thinks that I am. And if nothing else, she knows that this message is really important, which is really why I do what I do. Part of also the inspiration for this work on Little Allies was hosting a podcast with my dear friend Simone Morris. She has been such an inspiration for me. And over the last year and a half, we've interviewed a few dozen experts on the topic live on our podcast, Inclusion School. So be sure to check that out if you want to continue dialogue. We interview book authors, experts, people having this conversation with kids and the earlier generations. And my why for this work is my girls, albeit white girls. They're going to experience the world differently than boys will. They'll experience the world differently than people of color do. And while it's my privilege to have this conversation about racism and other sensitive topics, I've realized in comparing notes with my friends of color, that is not a choice. That is something you have to do to stay safe and prepare your children from the world. And I just feel like that's so unjust. That is so unfair. And all of our voices matter collectively. So if we can be a small part of creating a world that's a bit of a better place for this next generation, then that's just hugely, deeply meaningful to me. So that's a bit about me. If you have yet to introduce yourself in the chat, go ahead. I see it's really taken off here. This is awesome. So scroll through those, connect with folks that are different than you, share just who you are, what you're all about. If you want to share your LinkedIn profile, do that so people can connect with you there. We're also going to launch a short poll before we introduce one of our partners for today. We just want to know who you are and where you're coming from. So there's some choices there. You can select multiple choices if you happen to be a caregiver and a business leader, or an educator and an employee resource group leader. You can check multiple boxes there. Just how do you identify? So if we could, looks like we have 41 people actively on. Go ahead and check those boxes. We'd love to get a high completion rate on this so we know who we're talking to today. Oh, wow. It looks like it's evenly across the board, these categories. And if you're other, we'd love to hear in the chat what other means to you. We tried to highlight all the main audiences we suspected would be joining us today, but we may have missed something. So do share that on the chat. All right, I'm going to close down the chat, or the polling. So if you haven't cast your poll yet, please do so. I'm going to hit end and share those results so you can see who's with us today. So it looks like an even split, 50% primary caregiver looking for resources, DEI practitioner, and business leader. How fun is that? And we also have some educators, some employee resource groups, and some others. So this is awesome to know who we're speaking with. Well, I'm proud to be partnering with the diversity movement. They're a wonderful, fantastic resource for more education on diversity. I highly encourage y'all to subscribe to their newsletter and resources. They have some really great talking points and guides and events focused on this. So Susie Silver is with us. Susie, do you want to introduce yourself and what the diversity movement is all about?
Yes, hello, thank you, and hello to everyone. I'm Susie Silver. I'm a senior consultant with the diversity movement and joined the team about 2 months ago, so I could shout from the rooftops how excited I am about what we're doing and the people that I work with and partner with. We are all about helping create inclusive environments, mainly focused on the workplace. We're business strategists with a DEI focus. So we really help organizations ingrain DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion, in every fabric of an organization. And as Julie mentioned, we have extraordinary resources, and I am, yes, part of the team, but I was using the resources before I became part of the team because I was a practitioner on my own. And so from blogs to micro videos, we have an amazing community, which is, it's like a portal, but a community that you can join, and we post so much in there. It's an interactive community. We speak to each other. You have access to us as experts. There's articles and blogs and you name it. So I highly encourage you to join the community today, and there's a link I see in the chat there. Please join us in our journey as well, and we're here to help you. And my link to this, I wanted to talk about the diversity first, movement first, because I'm so excited. I am a parent to two little allies that I hope. I have a 7-year-old and a 3-year-old. And I'm also a former educator. So I was in public education for 18 years. I taught high school, and part of my why, Julie, I loved your, the why, are my children and also the students that I served. I'm part of the LGBTQ community. I started sharing my story, and then I actually got into DEI work because I recognized the need to support and keep safe our LGBTQ students. And I started a lot of initiatives on the public school front here locally in North Carolina for that. And then, of course, what you were saying, just what as parents can we do? Do we say how much, how little? And those conversations are real, and the questions are real, and we need community. And I have found that on my own. I was working with corporations and big business and this and that, and then it was the side question of, hey, so I'm also a parent. What do I do about this? So I'm just so thrilled to be part of the diversity movement and part of this partnership with you, as well as this book comes out. And I just am so personally tied on so many fronts to this topic. So thank you for having us. And please, my email is Susie, SUSIE, at thediversitymovement.com. And I know there's some links in the chat. We're happy to schedule some talks with you all out there as well.
Yeah, and
Thanks.
it's important. There's a lot of free resources there too. So get, much like had that experience and you did before joining the diversity movement, there's great resources that are tangible. Everything this week from how to have the conversation about the verdict this week in your inbox. So I know I appreciate that. How to celebrate diversity month. It's April, is celebrate diversity month. So really timely topics. Can't say enough good stuff about the diversity movement. And they're helping us get the books of Little Allies in little hands. And that is, I'm so thankful to have a partner with great reach and a great team like that. And just a note, the book is available. We'll talk a bit more about that at the end, but online proceeds, all of the profits that we make from online book sales, primarily through Amazon and some other channels, 100% are going to organizations doing this work with kiddos and helping educate anti-racist kids and educators and many other causes. So we're actually rotating organizations we can give the proceeds to. So this is not a for-profit endeavor. We do talks on this in corporate America, but our real purpose for doing this is to give back. So just wanted to mention that. So let's get into some content. I know y'all want to walk away learning something. Why do we need to talk to little kids about this? The why for this conversation, and some things I've learned, some trip ups along the way in having this conversation with little ones in my life, what I think being a little ally means and what it doesn't mean. And I think there's a lot of self-proclamation of allyship that doesn't sit so well with our friends of color and communities that are marginalized. We don't get to self-proclaim to be allies. It's really in the eye of the beholder. And active allyship is what we're talking about today. And I think this is a super tangible way that not only you can be an ally in the workplace, like many of you are, but also in home, because there's no switch. There was never before the pandemic, but especially if you're working from home right now, like you can't be an ally at work and at home, or not both. It's not an either or, it never was. But I think now bringing these tools home to our kiddos, since we're spending more time with our kids, whether that's a good thing or not, you could argue, depends on the day. And then how to develop little allies. So I've got a few strategies, tales from the trenches, if you will, that I've learned from hosting the Inclusion School podcast, from writing Little Allies, and from having these conversations with little people in my life. And then we want to spend the last 5 minutes really hearing from you on what you're taking away from this conversation, what you can do on your ally journey to propel this forward. So first, why talk to kids about diversity and inclusion? And I just want to take a step back and make sure everyone understands what we mean by diversity. I think oftentimes we liken this to race and gender, and those are certainly visible attributes of diversity. Not always, but sometimes able to identify by the eye. And our brain likes those categories that we can see. But as you can see in this picture, I would say even though these kids definitely have different races and genders, and there's obviously a child in a wheelchair that probably has a disability, there's more than meets the eye here. When we talk about diversity with my kids, it's more about different perspectives. And not to water down the definition by any means. The racial conversation is very important, obviously, as well as gender and disabilities and LGBTQ plus. However, to recognize that everyone has unique differences and we want to celebrate those differences is very much the message that little kids naturally understand, they gravitate towards and get. And so they'll see a difference in their friend, their playmate, and be like, hey, well, tell me more about that. Like, what's going on? Like, why do you wear that brace? Or why do you have glasses? Or whatever they notice that's visible. But I want you to make sure you understand diversity is more than meets the eye. It's where you're from, your socioeconomic status, the perspective you have, your personality. And if we can broaden these terms, it brings more people into the conversation, because all too often I hear, well, I'm not diverse, air quotes there. I would argue we all have a diversity story, and by broadening that, we can bring more of our allies into the conversation that need to be having this conversation, that probably think they don't need to have the conversation. And developmentally, there's some really interesting milestones. So there's some great literature out there that we'll share with you, research that's been done by some great experts that showcases as early as 3 months old. So I have a 7-month-old. This is like very relevant to me. Babies are drawn more to faces that match theirs of their parents and caregivers. Isn't that interesting that kids identify that early? A baby signals this. At 2.5 plus, children begin to use race as a factor in deciding who to play with. And between 4 and 5 years, learned racism is at its peak. So Black and Latinx children don't really have a preference in their own racial groups, but white children do. So what's that all about? right? Why are we forming these beliefs and attitudes so early in life? And I think it's worth saying with the recent news event, you probably saw in Columbus, Ohio, my home, unfortunately, there was a 16-year-old Black girl, again, murdered by the police this week. And there's this adultification bias that children of color experience, especially Black children are treated much older than they truly are. And this is rooted in our history of slavery and adultifying children and before they're actually seen as adults. And so these are all like things that are happening to our kids every day, whether you have white children, brown children, Black children. Racially, I think it's really important to say it's not too early to talk to them about racism. We're not protecting them because they're already forming their own biases and beliefs. So now, obviously, there's what to talk to them about that we'll get to in a minute, because we want to meet kids where they're at developmentally and not introduce too much heavy stuff or violence too early. But we got to be real with our kids. We're not protecting them by sheltering them from the world. And representation matters. So y'all might have seen, there's a wonderful organization I had a chance to spend time with on our podcast, CCBC, Children's Cooperative for Books Center. Excellent resource. So they take all the children's books produced every year. There's about 3,000 plus produced every year globally. And they note the racial and protagonist identification here. And as you can see, I don't think it's a big surprise. And this is 2018 numbers, but the numbers are largely unchanged year to year. So I just like this graphic better. That's why I show this picture. 50% of main characters in books are white. Okay, so, and this is actually American, I should say. This is US data, not global, unfortunately. 27% are animals or other types of characters, not human. 10% African Americans, 7% Asian Pacific Islanders, you may have seen the APAI, Latinx, 5%, and 1% Native Americans. And so if you total up the left-hand side of this slide, you're going to get a number that's less than animals being represented, unfortunately. And this matters. This matters because if you don't see yourself reflected in a book and you have to read books that are about characters that are different skin color than you already start to develop these biases that maybe I'm not, maybe I don't fit in, maybe I don't belong. And so for our kids of color, they're woefully underrepresented in books. And unfortunately, as I went to diversify my bookshelf, when I saw the statistic, I'm like, not in my house. Oh, it was definitely on my bookshelf, right? Countless animal books and white kid books. And so as I've diversified my bookshelf, and we'll make a lot of recommendations on books you can add to your bookshelf, it became obvious too that the books that had kids of color in them were very overt messages about race and identity. And I think that there's a time and a place for that. What I ended up finding with my child, though, as we'd sit down to read a book, is she wasn't as interested in those books, partly because probably it was a character different than herself. She didn't see that mirror of herself that's really important for kids, but also because the messages were like uniqueness is good and blanket statements like that she just didn't think it was a compelling story as much. So we've got to have a good story as well as representation. And so what's great is that books are coming together that naturally showcase the real lived experiences of kids of color in a way that's interesting and also impactful on our children. So that's where I saw an opportunity for Little Allies and part of writing it, but also the events of last summer. So with the murder of George Floyd, I was tongue-tied on what to say to my daughter. So I chose not to say anything for the first week or so. And then, of course, she heard about it. At age 6, she heard about it. We chose not to watch the video with her. It's something I couldn't quite stomach myself and didn't think it was appropriate for a 6-year-old to see. But we did talk about it. We talked about race and policing and violence and racism. And she now has a working definition of what racism is and knows how to call it out when she sees it. She had a kid say a racist comment on the bus 2 weeks ago, and she quickly said that's racism. And the kid no longer talked about it. And so our kids see these things. They see microaggressions happening in their friend groups. We can't protect them from this, but they need language. They need words to talk about. So this is a drawing she drew last summer. And this is her, a little white girl with blonde hair, saying, "Do you want to be my friend?" And if you can see on the other side, this is a kid of color that says yes. And it still brings tears to my eyes when I see this, because I didn't ask her to do this. She unsolicited drew this drawing. What it told me, though, in the moment is kids want this. Kids see diversity as additive. Kids see the benefits that far outweigh the uncomfortableness of this, and she naturally wants to have friends that are different than her. So again, we learn the racist beliefs. We learn to surround ourselves with people that are like us. And if we wait too long in life, it's really hard to unlearn and undo those things. So if we start early, we can encourage more diversity, more knowledge, and knowledge is 80% of the journey for any ally, regardless of age. And if you think, I have corporate leaders that think this conversation is going to go away. Okay, well, we had the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, check, like moving on. D&I is non-negotiable for future generations. This conversation is not going away. It's only going to get stronger. I firmly believe that, because Gen Z, the generation that was born after 2007, is very diverse, and they believe that inclusion is a top factor in deciding where they want to work and where they want to spend time with. So you can see, I think, little known fact here is that this is the first generation that is not majority white, by just a small sliver here. But we have growing populations of kids of color. And so they've naturally experienced so much more diversity that they see it as a benefit, that they see this as the way the world is, and they want more of it in the future. And this is what's really interesting too, is the number one racial demographic growing right now is biracial or multiracial, which is again signaling this blend of inclusion, that there isn't this black versus white or brown versus black and white. We're all in this together, and I'm really excited for the future because of them. They can't solve it alone, though. So just a short story from the books. This is one of the pictures that from Little Allies. All of these stories, all these microaggression little vignettes that I share in the book are made a little bit more basic so that children can understand it. It's a fourth grade reading level. But my friend and partner on the Inclusion School podcast, Simone, shared the story with me a few years ago, and it really was unsettling for me. Her daughter at the time was 3 years old, a Black girl playing on the playground at a preschool, and a white boy came over to her and said she did not belong. And unpacking it later, as you might imagine, some of the staff got involved and brought in the parents. It was clearly racially motivated. And I thought, if a kid at 3 years old has to experience being told they don't belong, like, that is just fundamentally wrong. And I have to admit, the way I handled this was a bit more as a white savior than I would do right now, knowing better. I said, "Simone, we have to fix this. We have to figure out how to solve this problem." And so we started the Inclusion School podcast, which is great that she forgave me for being a bit of a white savior in the moment, because I just was so upset. I thought, we have to fix this. The good news is coming out of that story really inspired much more story sharing. So our stories matter. And if you think that's just a one-off experience, I've heard a dozen other stories, primarily of kids of color, those with disabilities, or those that feel different, that feel or have been told overtly they don't belong. So I'm gonna pause here for a discussion question in the chat. And I know the chat's really active right now with introductions and sharing tools and resources, which is awesome. Why do you want to talk with children about diversity? I'm curious to hear from you. And if anyone wants to raise their hand, you can share live on video or audio too. Let's just pause for discussion here.
Hey,
Awesome.
Julie, one comment, I don't want it to get buried with a lot of introductions here, but Naomi shared, when we were talking about milestones, she shared as early as 3 months, babies notice physical differences, which we erroneously contribute to race. Noticing difference is natural, but perpetuating the lie of skin color as a separator is intimately tied to perpetuating anti-Blackness and white supremacy.
Yeah, that's
That was really good clarification.
Yeah, thanks, Naomi. Yeah, and you know what? And that's such an important point, that we don't oversimplify these studies and make it about the marginalized and other. That's so good. Thank you. Melody, you want to share? I saw your hand raised, Melody. You're on mute.
Thank you. I've been working in this field for 30 years at the corporate level internationally. And I too, about 20 years ago, decided we're too late. And it's like, this is so remedial. These people should know. And then I've noticed that nothing changed. Nothing changed. So 20 years ago, I dove in with my kids who are now in their late 30s and early 40s to develop programs for teenagers, because it gets a lot. If it's bad on the playground for little kids, it's really bad at school for teens. And so it's, and we're a multiracial family. I'm multiracial, and so hence my kids are. So I'm thrilled, actually, Julie, to get your book for my first grandson, who's 4. And I've just noticed that the books for little allies or about little kids are mostly girl children. And so would like to encourage anybody who wants to write a book to write one about where the protagonist is a boy kid.
It's funny because we want to do some add-on books to it, and Tommy is a white boy that he has some issues in book number 1, but he works through it. But I really like the idea of having him centered in the next book.
So a spin-off books.
What was that, Melissa?
A spin-off book for Tommy. I love it. I'm gonna mute so other folks can talk.
Please. I'll read off some of the chats join there. But yeah, there's a couple terms just to be familiar with. Own voices is really important, especially in the children's book area. Something I learned, that we write a story through our own voice. So being a white woman, I was very cognizant of that. And I did not want to write a book where a Black or brown child was clearly the protagonist. Now there's a whole cast of characters in the book, so there's all the dimensions of diversity are represented. But I think being mindful of that. And then the other term I'd throw out there is windows and mirrors. So kids need windows into other types of experiences, other genders, races, experiences. But they also need mirrors. And that was that representation slide is so problematic, because you need to see yourself reflected in the world. Otherwise you get a signal of like, I don't belong, or I'm not as important, that can go along with not being seen. Frank I talk about diversity to model the confidence for my child and how natural it can be with practice. I see my child more social and comfortable as his verbal could go as well. I love this. Danny had a great comment there. Minaz I am a woman, Muslim, Indian, living in expat in an Arab country in the Middle East. Yes, I'm all for diversity. I can imagine. Oh, Erica, one of my dearest allies, she has said it's important to discuss diversity with children so it becomes more comfortable and natural as they get older. Part of the issue today is adults don't have the language that hinders our children dramatically. Yes, Eric and I do unpacking racism workshops together. You can only imagine the number one thing people say to us is, I don't even know how to talk about this. So we're not doing kids just like a service by keeping them out of this conversation, because then you end up with people that don't know how to talk about this later in life. Rashmi we do a lot of unlearning too as adults. So definitely the right approach to start talking in this earlier. Yeah, it's unlearning. One point I'll make about that is I was reflecting on my education experience here in the United States in the Midwest. So just for context, I learned about American history, not once in 8th grade, not twice in junior year of high school, but 3 times in college as well. And the same watered down, whitewashed, white supremacist, manifest destiny version of history was taught to me all 3 of those times. And the message I got is slavery was over 100 years ago. So like, get with the program, things are better. Women have the right to vote. Like, we're all done here. Like, let's just move on. And I was also raised to be colorblind because I grew up in the 90s here in the Midwest. And unfortunately, all of those things I am deeply unpacking still today, because my primitive brain that saw those things and those patterns, I believe, so many times, has to realize there's a different version of history I didn't learn. And why is that? Why would I be told everything was solved for when it really wasn't? Well, if we're not aware of a problem, we can't solve it. And this is part of the underpinning of white supremacy and a patriarchal culture that wants to keep the systems in check to benefit those that are in power. And so I know that's a lot to process. It was for me, but that unlearning comment, I couldn't underscore more, because and our brain doesn't like that. Once it thinks it knows something, it doesn't want to unknow it, right? So it's a process and it takes a lot of education. But if we start early, then that unlearning doesn't have to happen as much for our kiddos. So what do I mean by being a little ally? I always talk with adults about choose your own adventure. And Erica, you're going to love that I changed this slide from adults to kids. So if I thought about ally roles that our children could play, and for the most part, I mean kind of K-5 as the target audience for little allies, but this extends certainly into middle school, and as high school, you can have much more profound conversations. But thinking about our little people, 10 and younger, think about they could be a friend to somebody that's different than them. Jane in her drawing very much wants to signal, I want to be a friend. And she has several friends of color that she sees as additive and as positive. Believe me, when she wants to have a birthday party, I'm like scouring the invitation list. Like, do we have diversity here? And she knows, like, I'm going to ask her about that. So it's part of a two-way accountability there. They can be a supporter. So they can signal to someone that I'm on your side. And in the book, Little Allies, we talk about being a quiet ally. This doesn't have to be somebody that's, putting on your rescue cape and saving the day. That's not what an ally does. You could just be standing with somebody when they're by themselves, for example, or signaling to them, I'm on your side, by coming over to them and being empathizing with them if they felt left out. Amplifier, there's a lot of great examples in the book of what I call microaggressions, so little subtle signals you don't belong. Everything from overtly saying you don't belong to being told that you're different or you're less than. And an amplifier in those moments might get a teacher involved if they don't have the words to say, or they might say, well, why'd you say that? Or help me understand, or I don't think that's cool. Right. And it doesn't have to be this long-winded conversation. It's just an amplifier to say, hey, not okay with me. That doesn't sit well with me, or I'm going to help you unpack that. An advocate, how could you advocate for people that are different than you as an ally? How could you be there for somebody that's different than you? How could you say support messages like Black Lives Matter and girls and their confidence, or whatever that could be as an advocate? Promoter. I'm going to actively promote people that are different than me. And that's going to be, asking them to be on my project team, or seeing them as an additive to something I'm already working on in school projects. So again, choose your own adventure as an ally. There's lots of different ways to signal that our kids want to be inclusive. And there's no one size fits all to this too. But not everyone is an ally. So in my research with adults, I usually find this spectrum. And so most of the survey data, most of the demographics around this show that attitudinally, 80% of people believe in diversity and inclusion. They see it as a positive. They believe that they themselves are a supporter of it. That means like 20% though are quite apathetic. And so I think for you, this data tends to be more adult oriented. But if you think about the apathy in this conversation, I hear these things all the time. Oh, this isn't a problem here. Or our household, we have one book with a kid of color, or my daughter plays with one friend of color. We had a Black family over for dinner last week. Those are all apathetic types of statements. So tune up your ally radar for that. Be willing to hear those things and interject with those things. I usually just say, when someone tells me not a problem here, I usually say, well, that's really rare. I haven't met anyone or organization or any family that's not dealing with some of these issues. I'm curious to learn more. And usually as you unpack it, they start to realize, like, oh, maybe I'm just kind of putting a blanket on this just to feel more secure and safe, like I've got it figured out, because it's uncomfortable to lean into this conversation. It is uncomfortable. It's comfort with discomfort by nature. Most people are curious though, and this is where kiddos are. They're so curious about differences. They're naturally interested. They're not judging differences usually. So when we shush them for noticing differences, or tell them not to say or talk about these things, don't ask about the wheelchair, don't ask about their skin color, we're teaching them that difference is bad. And oftentimes that's the parenting technique I was taught. And so I quickly learned to be quiet about it, but instead engage their curiosity, see it as a positive thing. Like, I'm so glad you're curious about this. How might you ask a respectful question of somebody that experiences difference? Because all too often, and I see this in my work with adults, is like, where are you from? People ask that well-intentioned, usually white people asking a person of color that. A person of color might say, well, I'm from, Ohio, or, I'm from Indiana. Like, well, where are you really from? And those kind of questions are not respectful, they're othering, and they're problematic because it makes the person feel like they're different and signals it out. So with my daughter, she has several friends of color, and we always talk about how to ask those questions respectfully. And so she might notice, like, hey, I noticed that she was over at an Indian American girl's daughter uh, a friend's house a few weeks ago for a birthday party, and she noticed that her mother had different clothing on. And so she asked her about that. I noticed that your mom was wearing a different kind of dress. Like, what? I'm curious to learn more about that. Like, why does she wear that dress? And that's a respectful way to ask, or ask about food, or hey, I noticed something different, rather than what kind of food do you eat, or where are you from, or why did she wear that dress? Like, preface it with curiosity and then ask a question. And it's always better to ask a question when you have a relationship already with somebody. So teaching our kids, that's not the first thing we ask about. Develop a rapport, treat them as a human first. And as the relationship progresses and trust progresses, we can ask better types of questions. So brainstorm those with your kids. And then a lot of people are active allies. A third of folks are get this. There are probably people on the call right now that already understand these things, believe in the importance of it. But just know it's a journey, not a destination. I'm still fumbling and stumbling. I mean, Naomi called me out on a slide earlier. I love that. Give me feedback. That's how we get better. Model that for our kids. I goofed up on that, or that advice I gave you, or what I told you to say last week. I actually rethought that. And this is like how I might frame it now, or this is what I learned from that. So we're all allies in training, and our kids naturally adopt these philosophies much more easily than as adults. So a term that we use in the book, gender non-binary, and if you're not familiar with this, it's the idea that gender is a spectrum and that people aren't exclusively identifying as female or male, masculine or feminine, boy or girl, that there's a broad middle ground here. And there's a child in the book, Sam, that identifies as non-binary. A parent and a caregiver in my daughter's school system was in kindergarten, actually, and identified as non-binary. And I talked with her mother, their mother rather, and the mother said, when the kids went, when the teacher would say, boys over here, girls over here, that their child did not know where to go. And so she had to have a conversation with the teacher about, our child identifies as non-binary. So they don't know which line to go into. And so the teacher simply said, okay, well, I won't do gendered separation anymore. I'll just do like the alphabet, or I'll just do like birth month. And so much of how we teach kids to gender things happens from a very early age. And just knowing that this might seem like a topic that you don't need to talk about with a elementary school age child. I'll tell you, I mean, I am seeing it increasingly, kids that identify LGBTQ, non-binary, trans. This happens early on in life, that they know their identity, and we need to believe them and honor them. And we also need tools and techniques to talk about that. So just letting our kids know. Of all the feedback I've gotten from the book, the story of Sam has been the most interesting conversations that people are having with their kids about that, because kids have a really interesting take on gender. So much of gender is socialized and they don't see it until they see it. So another thought question for y'all is, what does allyship mean to you? Defining little allies from your lens of the world. What does it mean to you to be a little ally? How can we have more of these allies in training and these curious kids and allies? And remember, I gave you all that different ideas, like a friend, a supporter, an advocate, an amplifier. So lots of great resources being shared. I love this. Catherine, are you seeing anything in the chat you wanted to bring light to?
Yeah, sure. A lot of stuff. I thought it was really interesting. Denise shared, she's so pleased to see that her son, who's in 9th grade, is reading Dreamland Burning and Killers of the Flower Moon in Oklahoma history. And she said she didn't learn about this history growing up in Oklahoma, and it's a really heavy topic, but really important.
So good.
Let's see. Frank shared, the most interesting phenomenon happens when you explore differences. We actually find more commonalities. So embracing difference and uniqueness.
Yeah, I love that. That there's a lot more, and that's what kids see too. They look for the common denominator first. And they usually don't see it through the lens of something like gender or race. They're like, well, we both like dominoes, or we both like to play this computer game. Like they see behaviors as commonalities and less about all these stigmas of our various identities. Yeah, and I think, oh, Naomi's, your fifth graders reading Ghost Boys, which examines racist police violence in Brooklyn. That's really, Naomi, it's really interesting. Age 10, so this is something I didn't put on that slide that I should add. By age 10, kids are really ready to have a conversation about some deeper issues. They know enough to talk about things like violence and slavery and policing. Before that age, it's just kids, at least what I'm finding with my 7-year-old, she doesn't have the wherewithal, the context to understand. Like she's still very much in the why would someone do that to somebody phase, which is a really hard question to answer as an adult. Is I'm not sure, babe. Like some people just look at people as they're less than them. And I don't know why that is, but it's wrong. And so our mantra in our house, right or wrong, is we see differences, we welcome differences, and we appreciate them. And we're not going to treat somebody differently based on their differences. And that resonates, at least at her level. But as I'll share in a minute, we've got to meet our kids where they are at developmentally. And as they head into middle school, you can have some much more, what I would say, deeper conversations with them about things like racism and sexism and violence and others. So how to develop little allies. And if you're paying attention, I am going to do some book giveaways, some trivia here in the next few minutes. So pay attention. You might just have an answer if you're paying attention. So the first technique I'd offer is vulnerability. And if you are a Brene Brown fan, like I am, one, I loved her before her podcast, but now I'm like borderline, maybe unhealthily obsessed with her now. But she talks a lot about vulnerability. So I mentioned her. And she has such a natural diversity of guests on her podcast, which is just so refreshing to see. All of the people of color and all of the different lived experiences that people have. So just all that to say, vulnerability is something I truly believe in for adults. But as you're leading this conversation with your kiddos, much like I did, if I goof up and make a mistake, just own it, admit it to our kids. And it's so hard to do this with our children because we want to be perfect for them. We want to protect them. We want them to see us as having the answers and a trustworthy source. So sometimes I'll just tell Jane, like, I messed that up. Like I shouldn't have said that way, right? Here's what I'd say differently this time. And it models for her, it's okay for her to make mistakes too, but it's really hard. Saying I don't know. She asks a lot of doozies nowadays, and I just on a daily basis say, I don't know. What do you think? Just what we're doing is modeling it's okay to feel uncomfortable, because if we're telling our kids you have to be perfectly comfortable to have this conversation, much like our adults, that's not sustainable. It's just not possible to have this conversation in a way that's fully comfortable, because these things are deeply rooted and deeply uncomfortable just by nature. Empathy and vulnerability go hand in hand. Our kids are naturally a bit more empathetic than we are too later in life. So empathy is not advice giving. Empathy is not sympathy, like woe is you. Empathy is not victim blaming. Empathy is taking on the perspective of somebody else. And, some people say it's putting yourself in other people's shoes. I personally don't like that one because, I have big feet and I can't wear someone else's shoes. So it's just a little limiting as a metaphor. But I really like Dr. Teresa Wiseman's perspective taking technique, and just saying, I'm going to try to think about this through the other person's perspective. So, Jane has a few bullying situations happening to her right now in first grade, and I'm sure it's going to get worse, but she shares these stories with me. And I just ask her, I'm like, is this a time when you want me to listen, or is this a time when you want me to give you advice? And almost always, 95% of the time, she just wants me to listen. And I'm like, because I don't even know what the heck she should do, right? And then at the end of her story, she'll usually say like, oh, well, maybe he thinks this, so I'll just say this next time. Like, sounds great, problem solved. And not that always works. I'm not oversimplifying this, but sometimes I think we underestimate the power of listening and truly empathizing with somebody that's different than us or experiencing something different than us. Because what this does is create spaces for others to feel seen and heard and belong. My 6-month-old, and she will let you know within 5 minutes if she does not feel seen, heard, and belong. And she's a little fierce. That's the word we're going with her. But I say all that to say it's a deeply human primal need to feel seen, heard, and belong. And for those of you that do diversity work in the workplace, there's very few workplaces that have a deep sense of belonging. I've yet to find a client where people all feel seen, heard, and belong, something we're striving for. But if we spent more time, again, early up front, modeling that for our kids, maybe they might be able to create these inclusive spaces where people truly feel like they can be their full selves. And if you don't know what to say, I just say, I'm so glad you shared that with me. And a lot of times that's all our kids want. That's all we want as humans, is just to have someone hear us and to see us. And especially if you're experiencing a diverse experience where you might feel less visible or less than, signaling to somebody, I see you, I hear you. It's all that they want. They don't want to hear your story or time when you did it, time when you experienced, or what you would do if you were in that situation, or questioning them on their intentions or what they did to contribute to the situation. No one wants to hear any of that. They just want to be heard. Now, candor, and I'm sharing a picture of the Bechdel test. If anyone's seen this before, oh, it's so good. So bookshelves, diversify those, but also watch the media consumption of your kids. So, and this is something I'm actively working on. And I just watched the movie Tommy Boy. Oh, it's like one of my favorite movies, but I just watched that with Jane last night. I was like, oh, the female characters are not well represented. I think there's one Black person in the whole movie. So all that to say, I don't follow the script every single day. I screw this up too. But how we can get better with watching our kids so that they have windows and mirrors into other worlds is just ask yourself some of these questions. Does the movie you have at least 2 female characters? Or you can also use this for characters of color. If not, it doesn't pass the test. But for females, especially, do they get to talk to each other? Do they talk about something other than a man? And oftentimes you see this, unfortunately, in our media, that it's very white male centric. I believe at last count, 82% of protagonists in films are male. So women are constantly asked, girls are constantly asked to see the protagonist and identify with a character that's of a different gender identity than you are. The same goes for white films versus historically, we've had films that are deemed for people of color, or Black films that white people don't watch or somehow don't feel necessary to watch. So diversifying where we consume our media and the images that we're showing our children. And good news is, at least I've been really happy with Disney over the last year. They're doing a much better job on this front. Lots of room for improvement, but doing much, much better. So just get comfortable feeling uncomfortable, call out problematic behaviors. If you hear something or see something that's potentially problematic or not inclusive, you yourself point that out, like, ooh, ouch, that didn't feel good, or ooh, I wouldn't say it that way. And if we don't say something when we see something as adults, our kids learn again to look the other way, to be bystanders, and to know it's easier to feel safe than to really call things out. Curiosity, ask open questions. Those what and how questions are so powerful. What do you think? How did you get there? How might they be looking at this situation? And listen to learn. Covey had that great 7 habit of seek to understand versus be understood. I think as parents, we go into being understood mode really easily and understanding instead. Meet kids where they're at. I love one of the experts we interviewed on the Inclusion School podcast said, just say, I wonder. After you read a book with a kid, say, I wonder about whatever. On page 3, I wondered about that. Like, what do you think? Be intentional, be consistent. There's a lot of white people that joined the Black Lives Matter racial justice work last summer. Where are they now? And that's concerning. We have to stay with this. We have to show a long-term commitment. Diversify your bookshelf and your media, the movies, the programming, cultural events, when we can finally be back together again. That's what allies do. And that's how we can model this for this next generation. A quick story, and then we'll do some trivia, is, we do notice differences. And I just am sharing another picture from the book here. One of the stories in the book is a Mexican-American girl, Lucia, that Allie becomes friends with, the main character. And what she does is she notices that she speaks Spanish, and naturally kids see this as really cool. Like, she doesn't just speak one language, she speaks 2 languages. So she has this curiosity about the difference instead of judging it as like her English isn't perfect. And so they teach each other words. And I think this is a great thing you can do as allies, is how can we learn from each other? And so if Lucia was struggling with an English word, Allie would help her, and then she would teach her the Spanish words. Jane, I actually borrowed this because Jane has a friend that's Danish that she teaches her Danish words, and it's really fun to see them talk to each other. And she sees difference as fun instead of judgmental through that. So another thought question for you before we do some book giveaways is tools, ideas that resonate with you. I always like to hear, what you're taking away from the conversation, and know that it's a journey. I'm not giving you any magic bullet solutions, unfortunately. I wish I had the magic answer. I wish I could wave the magic wand on this conversation and solve systems of oppression that have been around for hundreds of years. But unfortunately, we've all got to lead from where we're at. And you might think that this isn't a big deal, or this isn't going to solve this big problem. And you might be right, but collectively, if all of us were practicing a bit of this, if all of us were taking baby steps towards this, I firmly believe we would have a more diverse and inclusive world where our kids truly felt welcome. They all felt seen, heard, and belong, regardless of their dimensions of difference. So we'll play those back. Catherine, if you want to capture a few of the tools or ideas that resonated with you. I am going to do the trivia before we run out of time. So if you paid attention, the first person to get these answers correct will get a copy of the book. So we'll reach out to you for an address to send your book. First question, at what age is learned racism at its peak? So that's the first question. Go ahead and chat your answers. Oh, who won here? I believe Mariah got it, 4 to 5. Awesome, Mariah. Good job. Okay, cool. That was awesome. Thank you, everyone, for participating. You're paying attention. Yes. Okay, so that was the first one, Mariah. Chat us. If you can private message Catherine your mailing address, we'll get a copy of Little Allies out to you. Second question, how would you explain gender non-binary? So again, first person to respond correctly to this one. Oh, Leslie had spectrum. I love that. You jumped right on it. Oh gosh, good stuff, Leslie. So we'll be sure to get you a copy of the book too. And then last question, drum roll. Name one technique to develop little allies. What's one technique you're taking from this conversation? Who got it? Vulnerability. Danny, awesome. You'll get a copy of the book too. You picked the first tool that we talked about. That was awesome. So just know it's available on Amazon. It's $15.99. We don't get to set the price. We wanted to set it a little lower, but unfortunately, because it's a long book, 10-minute read, but it's 70 pages. So the cost is quite significant for all the illustrations. Just know that if you do choose to buy a book online, 100% of the online proceeds, again, go to great organizations supporting this cause with children. I mentioned I just wanted to give you some tools, some ideas to add to your bookshelf. I Promise is one of our favorites. It's written by LeBron. And just funny story, my daughter she plays basketball, but does not watch basketball. So she thinks LeBron is an author and makes shoes because she has LeBron shoes. I was like, isn't that kind of cool that she loves LeBron, even not knowing like what he's really known for? The book is wonderful though. I really love the book and the message. It's really powerful. Last Stop on Market Street is probably one of my very, very favorite books. It's a window into another world through a child and his grandmother experiencing different communities and cultures as they ride the bus home. And then The Day You Begin, I love it because it has a Black girl protagonist, and she talks about how not fitting in and finds allies. And it's a journey that I think kids can all relate to, feeling like that first day of school or that butterfly in your stomach feeling. So it's a good story, and it also has a really diverse perspective and good narrative on allyship. So just to mention a few other books, if you're struggling to diversify your bookshelf, those are our top 3 favorites right now, but it's always changing. What do you want to do? So I'd love to spend just the last couple minutes. Anything you're taking away from this conversation? I know the chat has been wildly active, which is so awesome. Catherine, if you're seeing anything here you want to pull out, feel free to jump in.
I'm sorry, I haven't, because I'm trying to collect addresses here, but there's...
That's okay. I see Naomi had Jacqueline Woodson as one of my favorite authors. She has so many good books. You're right. And a lot of these authors, like, just follow them on Instagram and you can see their new books come out too. That's something I'd mention as a tangible next step. Follow us on Instagram. We have the Little Allies handle. We post every single day there. And We're actively trying to support messages, tools, resources, great organizations like the diversity movement. So I'd highly encourage you to just follow people if you're on Instagram or Facebook. Check out the diversity movement. They've got some great content like Susie shared at the beginning. Create more communication, says Nancy. Carry the conversation forward with my circle. That's one of the most powerful things you can do, Manaz. And I think these little things matter. So just one last story I'll share with you. My daughter has a friend that I had added my email pronoun, the pronoun signature, pronouns to my email signature, if I could say this right. And I'd reached out to my daughter's friend's mom to coordinate a play date. And she saw my email signature, the she, her, and she replied back and she goes, you know what, I'm so glad you had that in your email signature because my son is gay. And now I know that you're someone I can trust to talk to. And I just thought, well, my pronouns aren't that big of a deal. Like certainly people know my gender identity, but what, again, a privilege I have to not have to tell people my gender identity because it matches the way I look. And this was a bridge to somebody that I've now developed a very deep friendship with just by way of her seeing my pronouns. So I just want to share that story as these little things that we do have lasting and surprising, profound effects long term. So I promise you, even if you just do one small thing, it's going to make an impact. Sharing the book and info with my networks. Thanks, Denise. Allow kids to express themselves on any issue, says Hannah. I love that. Melody had connect the work I'm doing with teens with folks with little allies. Yes. Elizabeth, buy your book and some of your recommendations. I love that. Sujan, you had a new book on the same team band, the last stop at Market Street. Ooh, thanks for sharing that. We'll have to get that one. Naomi had be clear about the difference between who people are and how systemic inequity functions. I really appreciate that distinction. Susie shared the portal link where you can sign up there and it's no cost. Denise said yes, more here. And then Catherine put the direct link to Little Allies where you can buy it there. You can also download, we have a discussion guide that goes with the book, an ally promise that kids can actually sign as like a certificate. And then, yeah, you can follow us on Instagram as well. This has been so awesome. Thanks everybody for joining this important conversation. Susie, thank you for your partnership. Catherine, thank you for monitoring all of this and setting us up for success today. I'm so proud to be with y'all. Just our contact information here, if you didn't catch it in the chat. I respond to every email I get, usually same day. So if there's something you didn't feel comfortable surfacing or we didn't get to in this robust conversation, just shoot me a note over there. I promise I'll respond and continue to follow our work. And if you can get this Little Allies book in little hands, we'd love for it to be everywhere. It's such an important message. And again, something that we want to give back the online proceeds to. So thank you so much for being with us today, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.